later. I call the meeting to order. The March
Okay,
meeting of the
I
Board of
will
Trustees of
show the agenda. Tell me if you can see
Yep.
the agenda.
Yep.
Yes? No? Yeah, okay, great. So we don't have a quorum for the minutes, so like you said, we'll come back to that. Let's go to the treasurer's report. And Edward, I'm not sure if you're well versed enough right now to speak on it because the committee meeting was supposed to be yesterday and did not go down. So without Doug here, I can just give some quick highlights. Doug's commentary about the state of the budget is that the gap for per pupil is closing, and the school is looking to end the year in a strong financial position. The big story is some slight variations in enrollment, which are a net positive in terms of the fiscal status. The school spending is down because of the pandemic, although there's an increase in spending in other areas. And there is a nice injection into the reserve that is resulting from having PPP money to spend on compensation. And we are hoping to get that PPP money forgiven, and that's in the process of happening. So the school is in a good financial place right now. Are there any questions?
What do you know what the PPP number is? Is it on here someplace? I missed it.
It was over $1 million.
Well, that's good to know.
And I don't know if any of it has been forgiven yet. I think it's in the process of being forgiven. I don't know how much will eventually be forgiven.
Okay.
There was a round 2 of the PPP, but we are not eligible for it because the per pupil has not hit its catastrophic mark that we were afraid of. I think it's earmarked for businesses and organizations that lost 25% of their revenue, and that was on the table for per pupil that is not material.
And I assume the latest aid bill has calmed the nerves on state reductions, or am I being too Pollyanna-ish?
Thanks for that's a little Pollyannish. Things for the current fiscal year seem okay, but we're just starting budgeting for next year, and we're not feeling any better about next year than we did at this time a year ago. Last year, I think there was more federal aid passed than this year. There was like 6 trillion. This year is only a little less than 2 trillion, small trifling number. And that did not result in any increased funding for us. In fact, we were flat because any school aid was offset by state cuts. So that will probably happen again since the state still has revenue gaps from the tax base. And I don't anticipate that we'll be getting any increase in per pupil next year. The state's told us that preliminarily it'll be flat per pupil for the 2nd straight year. And that really does compound the budget when expenses continue to go up and the revenue stays flat. So the budgeting process for this year, like I said, for next year, it's just beginning and it's daunting.
Partially because you just don't know what you're budgeting for. Is that correct?
Yeah, and if revenue stays flat, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's only so much you can cut that's extraneous to make the bottom line happen. So the finance committee and the board have some big analysis to do while we wait for Albany to settle its budget, which hopefully will happen in the next 2 weeks. It's due April 1st. And we're crossing our fingers and hoping that that stimulus does lead to an increase in per pupil, but we just don't know that. And I'm not counting on it.
Okay.
Any comments or questions? Okay, Alejandro, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to the dashboard.
All righty, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. If you turn your attention to the dashboard, we're reflecting an enrollment of 471. Actually, since the dashboard report came out, we added an additional student. So we continue to get students and backfilling in key grades. Just for clarity, this has been, I think, as a result of the way we've positioned ourselves in our messaging, in our info sessions. A lot of families that have been applicants for next year have enjoyed so much what we have going on, especially relative to the approach of other schools, and have been swayed and decided to join us this year, which I think is a testament to both our student recruitment efforts, but the strength of current approach. On the student recruitment side, the dashboard shows 177 applications. The mailer has in fact hit, among other key connections that we've made, and so our number of applications, even in the last week or two, has gone up above 200 unique applications. The things to note is that we did have a virtual student fair this past weekend, and we had many people join our live info session. As I mentioned just earlier, the mailer has hit, and we continue to be aggressive with some of the ways that we've done outreach. I think this is certainly had been a strategy all along, but definitely in conjunction with that of the outreach committee, we have been focusing in on reaching out to building partners and developing and creating like specific conversations about how we can support one another. And we've actually done a lot of that work in the last few weeks that I think are going to bear fruit as we go along in the enrollment season. As we all know, the lottery is a week and a half away on April 2nd. We expect that the recruitment season is going to continue. And so even though that the formal date of the 2nd will come and pass, we continue to start or continue on with our recruitment efforts exactly the same, if not adding to them. That's it on the recruitment side. If there are any questions.
Anyone?
Again, I'm sorry?
Yes. Where are applications numerically typically at this stage in the calendar year?
That's a great question. We were looking at exactly a year ago around the sort of pandemic date that we last had, and I'll tell you right now, I think we were looking at somewhere around 400 applications at this time. So it certainly is down.
And actually, can you give me the metrics for a year that wasn't the pandemic? Because I don't know if that's a good indicator. Do we have the year before?
I can get that data. I don't have it on hand, but I can get that. I think that is important. It is fair to note that this is certainly down relative to the past. Like it's very clear to say that this is certainly a downturn compared to years past. So it's yeah. So that's 100%. We're acknowledging that that's where we're at. We know that across the sector that we're seeing numbers down across the board. It's, we don't have anyone giving us their full data to say like what they're experiencing. I do know that Harlem Hebrew is experiencing close to like a half a slash, like a 50% reduction in the number of applications. He wouldn't share with me the exact numbers, which is perfectly fine, but so I know that we're not alone in this. Yeah, but I can certainly get you that data, Brandy, after the fact of where we year to date 2 years ago.
And then additionally, two-part question. Did you have conversations with the peer school, Harlem Hebrew, on what they're doing to sort of try to close this gap? But, obviously, since this is.
Yeah, I mean, they're
kind of like
their approach
down, like, it's probably going to take extraordinary measure. I don't mean extraordinary as in impossible, but I just mean extraordinary in the nature of, in excess of what we have historically done to close this gap.
Yeah. So their approach is slightly different. They're casting a wider net because they are just more of a sort of they're a CMO, and so their approach is a little bit very heavy on like the ad side, not so much on pounding pavement necessarily. And so they are trying, and they have a few schools, so they're trying to figure out like how to diversify within their individual schools and how to push people. If one of the schools had in excess of seats, that they would then push them over to the other school. And so their strategy is a little bit different than ours. They had little to no on the ground, like grassroots approach. They had started, in my last conversation a few weeks ago, they were mulling over whether or not they were going to start focusing in on sort of the local areas. On our end, I think we, in the student recruitment meetings, have been very keen on doing just about anything possible. So, you know, following up on leads of people who are integrated in the community. We've now had, I think, 7 or 8, you know, specific conversations with program directors or program leaders. You know, Ms. Maitland, the student recruitment coordinator, has literally gone to salons, to we're dropping off postcards at houses of worship, etc. And additionally, casting a very specific net with our advertisements on Facebook and Instagram, and targeting the unique areas. So I do feel like we're certainly continuing to like do everything, like being very dynamic in the way that we're approaching it. I think it's just going to have to be just much more of it. You know, I think that compared to last year, we had a really concerted effort in the summer. I think this time around, we've taken that approach and taken it to most of the enrollment season. I think if we continue to pound pavement, you know, I'm not saying it will reach numbers pre-pandemic, but we might be in a place where the quality of the applications feel higher than in past years, right? So we might be at a smaller like number. But like,
I just got to deliver at the door, so I'm just going to turn off my camera, but yeah. I'm still listening. Yeah.
So that's the other piece that we've been doing. We've been cleaning up our data on a more regular basis, and engaging with the wait list and the people, not the waits, the people who have applied, and encouraging them to attend our sessions. And I think compared to any other year that I've been at Harlem Link, the attendance in our info sessions has been stronger than ever before. I think families are more keen on finding out more about the school. And even though it's hard to have those metrics quite yet, I feel like we've left every info session with families feeling very excited about Harlem Link, and intending on making Harlem Link their choice if they haven't already decided that before they came into the meeting. But if anyone else has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Anyone else?
I have a question. I know that we're studying against the effects of the pandemic on enrollment. Do we have any preliminary conclusions at this stage?
Do you mean about how things will turn out? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in one sense, yes, how things would turn out, and to whether it's more of a long-term thing or a short-term thing.
Yeah, I would say the positive metrics that I'm seeing are that in our pre-K class, over close to half of the expected enrollees are current Harlem Link students. So we feel pretty confident in being able to get those seats very easily and continuing on. So I'm not so much concerned on the pre-K side. You know, the lack of applications and grades where we currently have gaps, so pointing to grades 2nd and 3rd, which would then become 3rd and 4th for next year. We're not getting a ton of applications in those grades, and so we're you know, that we're going to have to probably deal with the world where we have to do some very targeted upper grade enrollment, which is always harder to do. Families are less willing to move students, especially, you know, at that stage, and so we have to carry some of that gap with us. I feel pretty confident in the degree by which we've effectively served our current pre-K families, meaning that I think that kindergarten enrollment will be strong overall. But at this point, it's hard to say. We've seen a recent upshot of students in both districts 3 and 5, and in 10026. It's still not where we want it to be, but we have seen it go up in the last couple of weeks, which I think is probably a result of both the mailer and the individual info sessions, and therefore like daycares making us their like feeder sites, which is a nice sign for both this coming year and then for future sustainability. Then otherwise, it's really hard to tell. The Bronx number still continues to be higher than I want it to be, though it's leveled out in the last couple of weeks. But again, by virtue of the level of engagement that we're seeing from families as a result of our communication, like the families who have already applied, there is a sense and again, all this is informal at this point, that families seem to be like making Harlem Link their choice, it may be more than they have in the past. That doesn't not necessarily mean that like that equals, amazing enrollment. It just means that there's at least some positivity there.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, Steve, you want to go on?
Yeah, I can just briefly touch on attendance. So maybe in fact, I can talk about attendance by previewing one of the big points of the F&P discussion that's coming later on, because attendance is so intertwined with student achievement right now because it's at such a critical stage. There are going to be a few points at the F&P discussion coming out of the Education Committee that are positive and negative. The negative ones are basically the national picture and how we fit into it, which is actually pretty good compared to what we're hearing around the country in terms of our achievement. And the other negative point is about the difficulty of access. We're hearing horror stories from schools about disappearing children and can't find them at all. Huge drops in enrollment as people move to different states and countries. So a lot of shifting in the terrain, and how things turn out will be really unclear right now, just across the country. We have not seen that level of displacement in our student body, and we haven't had that level of disappearing of students. We've lost track of kids for days at a time, even weeks in the course of the past year. But we've been able to get in touch with everybody pretty consistently. However, we have not been able to get everybody tuned in and engaged in their academic instruction all the time. So what that looks like right now is 41.2% of our students are chronically absent. That is higher than it's ever been in the history of our recording it. And it's easier to be attending than it ever was, because you have to just zoom in and show up for one session and participate. If you're absent for part of the day, you're still marked present in our system. And now we're tracking the block by block, the components of the day, and I'll get into the F&P how we're using that data differently now that we've learned some more and made some shifts in our program in response. But back to attendance, that means that 2 out of 5 kids at our school are showing up to school less than 90% of the time. They're absent more than once every 2 weeks. And when that happens, and you combine that with the block by block attendance, and we have a trend where kids are showing up in droves early in the day, and then they're not showing up till later in the morning blocks or afternoon blocks as much, and you have a lot of missed instructional time for students. So it's especially hard to confront this data when you know how hard our faculty is working, our administration is working, and the quality of lessons that's happening in the Zoom world, which is really outstanding in pockets and consistent across the board. So we have a huge focus and effort and time on getting these numbers to improve. We started some new processes that we've shared in past meetings, and they've continued, and now they've grown. We use the 3-tier system for tracking attendance, just like we do in academics. Tier 3 is the students we are really worried about. Those are the kids who are under 81% attendance. Tier 2 we're also worried about. So every student has a mentor. Every student who has a Tier 3 category is given a case manager who does a little more intensive support than a mentor would do. And the consistency of implementation of that program has been a real challenge, partly because it's so hard to follow up all the time when you have this much absenteeism for students, partly because you've got families that are on the move or resistant to participating, and so they will not return calls and things like that. And so the social work team has had to give a lot of support and try to escalate. And so one thing we're doing about attendance is I mentioned to the staff last week that we had a couple of strong candidates. We had 3 really strong candidates for case manager. And so we're ready to make a decision this week about our addition to the team, at least temporarily, for the scope of the pandemic. We know we need more support for the social emotional needs of students, and also for just the basic logistical tracking and follow-up with families about attendance. So there is a whole host of efforts happening around attendance, both in the positive sense and the follow-up to people who miss time. We've been pretty steady since the fall at 86%, 85% average daily attendance, but that doesn't really mean much. The number that we're really accountable for is the chronic absenteeism, and that's very high. It was in the mid 30s last year before the pandemic, or maybe even with the end of the year as we hit the pandemic. And it was over 30% the year before as well. We have a target that's been set for getting it down when we're back and the pandemic is over. So this probably means in the next charter, 2 years from now, of 14%. So we want to work towards that number, and that's become our North Star for chronic absenteeism. So any questions or comments about the attendance plan?
Steve, what's the caseload for the average mentor?
So there's a few different categories. Let's start with case manager. The social workers have right now between 20 and 35 cases, which is pretty high, but we think it's manageable. The case managers who are not social workers, they have between 15 and 25. One case manager who's been especially diligent has more than 30. Mentors, most people on the staff have fewer than 10, depends on their role. So there are some mentors who have some time built into their schedule that they could use that others don't have. So they have over 10. And then for many of our operations team members, because they're always on the phone and with parents, and we've given them a lot, but we focused on giving them students who we expect to have high attendance, so they have to make very few calls. So it works out to be a pretty even distribution of work across the school. In my role, I have 2 mentees. I've had as many as 4. We shift things around based on the data. Operations team members have over 30, 25 to 30, but these again are not high need cases. They may have 1 or 2 absent students a day that they have to call, if that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll try to ask a question earlier, but I was on mute. When you on the video attendance, when we talked about sort of like a Harlem Link, telling people what Harlem Link's all about, you said there are many attendees. What constitutes many?
The information session, Alejandro, I think you were talking at the weekend about 12 or 13 at the info session.
Yeah, I'd say we probably averaged, if I had the aggregate at this point is probably close to 60 plus families have attended. And I think bearing over 8 to 10 info sessions, that's a pretty strong number. And these are active engaged. These aren't people who are just sitting back. These are people who are actively engaging in our in the actual Q&A.
Okay.
Anything more, John?
Look, when you listen, when you're listening to this, to these issues, as you mentioned, we're still working on the budget for next year. There's some terrifying confluences of events with low attendance, people moving out of the area, low participation in the draft, in enrollment, uncertainty about the state. There's a lot of what ifs out there. Now we have built up a financial reserve, but every year I say this, and we seem to get by. But I say, getting people into the schools critical. Whenever I've said that, I never had the perspective of how bad this year could be. But wow, we need to get people in. If we have to throw a $50,000 resource at it to be able to get more kids in the door, we have to do that. Not just for this year, but for ongoing years. So think as aggressively and widely as possible in this enrollment stuff. It's terrifying.
Agreed, John. Anyone else?
I second what John third what John just articulated.
And then on attendance, just quickly, is there a level at which you start losing dollars on attendance?
John, bring up enrollment real fast. I just want to echo a couple of things you said, and I definitely agree with the urgency, and I also think it's possible to reach the target enrollment numbers. I really do. They're kids and they have to go to school. You know, and every school is dealing with this, but kids are moving around, and I know the city is losing people, but I'm not seeing demographic changes that suggest that we're losing like massive populations. There's just displacement, and people are also moving in because rents are down. I mean, some things are changing. So I think that there are opportunities there if we're persistent, we're flexible, and we use our word of mouth really carefully and aggressively. And keep going. Like, we're not going to stop at the lottery, of course. Then I think we can close these gaps. But it's operational priority number one for sure. Back to the tents, John. Go ahead.
Is there a dollar amount at which we'll stop? Is there a percentage at which we start losing dollars?
What do you mean?
Is there a percentage of attendance where if kids drop below, we start losing on our per capita?
I understand. No, there's no impact on per pupil.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Steve, you want to move on?
Any more comments on dashboard?
Can I ask a corollary question to John's? Is there a percent, what is our attendance sort of break even point? I'm sorry, enrollment break even point. And I know that it might be a little bit nebulous because we don't know what the budget is, but if we had to ballpark it.
Well, we budgeted 95% of maximum size. And historically, that would allow us to have some leeway where kids are, moving out, and then we have a few weeks to replace them and bring new kids in. I think that in the last few years, we have been able to, as John said, get by on less than 95% attainment because we have had high cost special education enrollment than we budgeted. About 5 years ago, we made some changes to our program and really pushed hard to retain our special education students, and that has improved. There was a point in our last renewal. And with that, we've seen an increase in funding, but we have not increased our budgeted number because it's sort of a hedge against the overall enrollment that has not been strong the last few years.
I'm not exactly fine. I think I was asked, I was thinking of it the other way around, meaning, is there a certain number of students where if we don't achieve that enrollment, then operationally we're significantly hampered because the doesn't match what the ultimate overhead would be? I mean, obviously we could like decrease the number of classes and eliminate, the applicable teachers, but I'm just trying to understand what the ultimate the impact of the low enrollment may be, worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think that's an art more than a science. Maybe Doug, you have a thought about that? I think your question is at what point is enrollment so low that it causes ripple effect impacts on our program?
Precisely.
Yeah, so for this up and coming budget, we are at the very beginning, so I don't have that number just yet, but I can get that out to you shortly. And did everyone hear me?
Yes.
I mean,
Like when I think about the numbers,
Mhm.
I think we could lose 25 kids for a year or two of our total enrollment, and still be okay. We'd lose money, but if we felt it was temporal, we could work through it. The problem is if you're losing them at the wrong grades, and we know how tough it is to fill up the higher grades, and you'd be in really, really big trouble.
Yeah, there's a ripple effect. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you're missing first and second grade. So I think if we get down by 25 kids for 2 years in a row in first and second, in kindergarten and first grade, I think we'd be in a bunch of pain on ongoing years. So we'd be able to stay in business for like another couple of years, but the writing would be on the wall.
Mhm.
John, when you're saying 25 students now, are you talking about the enrollment we have now or the maximum size? Because we're already essentially
No,
30
no,
people under
we
the.
could be, no, we could 25 below where we are now.
Okay,
We
thanks.
could muddle through for a while because we do have excess cash. But as I said, the longer term damage, we can't backfill that stuff, and we haven't proven that we can consistently backfill. We're really bad.
Okay, thanks.
We're close to that 95% right now. We didn't start the year that way, but as Alejandra mentioned, we've been adding kids. We have not been losing kids. We've been adding kids throughout the year. Interestingly, there's been a lot less churn this year than there usually is. Fewer kids have come in and fewer kids have left. So mid-year. That kind of belies the notion that people are like scattering everywhere. Yeah, I know it's remote, so it's easier. We do have kids in different states and different places, but we don't know who's returning and who's not, and we expect a lot of them to return. So we'll see. We're watching this carefully, and we'll keep reporting it out.
Please.
Okay, I wanted to spend 5 minutes on this grant that we're working on that Josh is leading. John, you're helping, and Wojtka, you're doing a big lift in thinking behind it and a lot of the supports. Maybe Josh, you could spend a couple minutes just describing what this is and how it relates to our outreach committee, and I can chime in.
Cool, thank you, Steve. Young Men's Initiative and the Civic Engagement Commission, they're making these neighborhood coordinator roles, and the general idea behind it is get the vote.
Can you pick up the phone? Can you pick up the phone? You're not coming through clearly at all. Do you mind?
Sorry, is this a little bit better? Can people hear me now?
John, can you hear Josh?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I apologize about that. The idea.
If you guys can hear, it's just me. It's okay. It's okay. I can't hear much.
I think Josh is being chased by an orc behind him, so maybe that's the issue.
Is that really what's happening? All right, I apologize about the sound quality. The general gist of the grant is instead of getting the vote out, it's about getting the vaccine out. It's the idea of becoming one of the neighborhood coordinators behind vaccine information, helping people get connected to it, and working within the communities that really need that help the most. We're applying for it because there's 2 phases to the grant. Phase 1 is kind of help them with their agenda of getting the stuff out, which is kind of being these community leaders and working with other businesses and schools in order to get there. And phase 2 is much more about COVID recovery, which is a lot more focused on what we've been doing with helping out the school or even tech support and whatnot. Already, we've been in a lot of contact with a lot of our partners, including Scan Harbor, the Africa Center. I actually have a conversation with the BioBus right after this, who said they really want to partner with us. Reviewing the zip codes, the troubling zip codes that they want to support. I reviewed it last night against our zip codes of where our students are hailing from. Of the 42 different zip codes that we have children coming from, 35 of them are the areas that this grant wants to cover. So I think this grant is made for us. I think it's very good for the community involvement that I think we've been trying to do for a while. To quote them, the grant deadline is aggressive, so it's been very all hands on deck. We're putting together the grant right now, getting all of the other things in shape. The first part of the grant is for $10,000, and the second part is for up to $40,000. But that kind of covers all of the general information. Does anyone have any questions?
As I was thinking, I thought, I don't know if you have the answer, but we discussed this in our executive committee. The proceeds of the grant are allocable to what? Are they use restricted? Because I'm just trying to understand why, or I'm trying to understand how to make this dovetail with all the work that we need to do around enrollment. I mean, it seems worthwhile if we can have, you know, some of the work that we're doing in the community bolster our enrollment outreach, but I also want to make sure that we have the capacity to be administering this program where we clearly need to devote a lot of resources to priority areas.
Can I take a quick
Steve, did
stab
you want
at
to take that?
one of those two things? Josh and I have yet to dive deeply, maybe you have already by now, but I haven't, into what how the funds can be used. I know there'll be some overhead we can absorb into our budget, and there'll be some additional stipends we'll be giving out to like community partners or alumni who go out and like spread the word. So we'll come back with an answer about where the money can go and how much it can meet our already established expense needs. But with regard to the kind of percentage of effort and how it might distract from other work we're doing, I actually think it's a little bit like, in politics, like all news is good news, or celebrities, getting our name out there in a positive way helps the community, and it also gets our name out there, and that helps spread the word. It's similar to what we're doing with community testing. We're doing coronavirus testing in our schoolyard under our banner by beginning April 5th every Monday. Free to the community, anybody can come and get tested. So we're going to spread the word about that, and I think that will help enrollment. So I think, partnering with these organizations, Josh mentioned several others, some that Voic has connected us with, some that John has connected to, others that we've had longstanding relationships with. I do think there is time and effort required, and Josh is setting aside a lot of things to work on this right now. But this is work we had already planned to do, in a sense, forming these partnerships through the outreach committee. It meets a lot of other goals, and I think it will help us with our fundraising, our enrollment outreach targets and our community building outreach targets.
If I could just put like a tiny addition onto what Steve said. What Steve said totally tracks with it. We've had a lot of very good community involvement this year, and I think a part of that has to do with it's crisis time, and things now they're starting to open up. I think making sure that we are giving back to the community in a positive way, and we are linked to the community much more, will help keep those bonds, as opposed to them like fading off once the emergency period is over. We have me and Steve are going to be going over the budget as far as what the second part is going to be doing. I would say probably the first few months are going to be the most intensive, but I also think based on just the general places I have reached out to already, a lot of community partners that we have never been able to engage in such a grand way, I suppose, they're very excited about joining with us. I sent out emails to the John set me up with the Africa Center. Miss Jen and I sent an email to BioBus. We were just kind of taking shots in the dark and seeing who would be, and we thought we'd be relying more on the middle school presence. But these places really want to partner with us, and they really want to make that difference too. So I think as a long-term thing, I think this is a very good investment of our time in strengthening the school. Did that answer your question? I apologize.
No, it does. I just think that we'll have to be very deliberate about doing very well all the other things that we were doing in connection with enrollment outreach, and being very intentional about having this be supplemental rather than, replacement. And, I think I'm preaching to the converted around, the need to really have the numbers be substantially better.
I think, Randy, from my standpoint, in my, I think, excitement around the grant, in that it makes good on the sort of like symbiotic approach that we're taking with outreach, because it's hard to like keep making asks of individual places without offering a ton in return. And so I think by virtue of doing that, I'm excited about what that means, because it actually means like, hey, listen, like we're asking for this thing and your support in getting out the word. If we can drop off applications, if we can get access to your listserv, etc. And in return, like we can, like we have the site for your community, etc., which I think that's played out well. Like even the testing has played out well, and sort of like as one of our talking points, like, hey, what we have to offer, in particular with like the daycare, is where like we might have some overlap and theoretically might be, you know, a threat to their enrollment, and yet they feel positively because we have these other things that we can offer. So I'm seeing it from that standpoint. So I see it as actually as an extra like little touch point that we can give these other partners, so that they feel as though, you know, we're giving something back and not just asking things of them. So that's how I'm interpreting the possibility of this happening.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things we've asked Voika and her colleagues to address is exactly this sort of thing, so that we become more fixed and continue ongoing presence in the immediate vicinity of the school. And it's a difficult thing to implement under these extraordinary circumstances, but I think it's the beginning of a broader approach that we hope to continue over the years that will get us more firmly planted in our neighborhood.
Yeah, if I may, I know I've been silent on this end, but this is not something that's willy-nilly. I've spoken to Josh and Steve about it. And it's definitely directly connected to what we had already started to plan out. What's great about this is that it's helped us move the timeline up even more, so that, you know, it's not something that's slowly enrolled or rolled out, but it's definitely within the plan, just to be sure. And we have not had time to like write it all down and be able to present it to the board, but it was already in the plan.
Thank you, Voika. Anyone else? Steve, we want to do the quick things we have to do with the quorum, because I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes to go to my doctor's appointment.
Yes, let's do that. Let's do a quick vote, and then Doug will have a 2.5-minute update on the PPP, and then we can wrap up with the achievement data. So does anybody have a motion to accept the minutes?
I move that we accept the minutes of the February meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Anybody object? So moved. The minutes have been accepted.
Beautiful. Okay, Doug, do you want to give us 150 seconds or less?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't get on in time. I didn't have the updated time from 12:30 to 12. So last call, we talked about me gathering some information about the second round of the PPP. We will not be eligible for the second round. In short, we would have had to lose 25% of our revenues. And at this point, we haven't. So that disqualifies us from essentially applying for the second round. So I just wanted to give the board that update. Any questions, concerns, or comment?
Anything been forgiven yet from the first round, and do you have any forecast about that?
Nothing yet. Nothing has changed. My application has been completed. I have to double check with our auditors to see if it was sent off, which I believe it has not, because I did want to hold off a little bit just to see what other schools did, so that we can learn from their mistakes, if any. But I believe in the coming weeks we should have a little, well, complete clarity on the first package that would or will be going out.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the F&P data. So first of all, and the Education Committee has asked me to express this to the staff, the appreciation for a remarkable effort to just complete the Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment cycle. People worked extraordinarily hard to arrange all these individual assessments while planning their lessons. Lots of other people besides class teachers stepped in to help and provide extra hands which were needed. The APs coordinated everything and organized with David from our data team all the data work. Made sure teachers had the materials they need and knew how to do this. And we were able to assess, which is a huge missing link in a lot of places around the country. The first thing authorizers are asking is, do you have data? Our answer is yes, we have a lot of data. This benchmark data is not something that we can take for granted in pandemic, so pulling it off has been a remarkable achievement. And I mentioned there's some good news and there's some bad news. I mentioned the bad news already. The bad news is students who aren't attending, which you'll see in the next slide, are not doing as well. And nationally, numbers are down. Lost seat time, and our numbers are right in line or better than that trend of being down. We adjusted our benchmarks knowing that the pandemic would cause some loss of learning compared to normal times. So we created something called a pandemic benchmark, which is similar to and a little bit more rigorous in some cases than these accountability benchmarks here. And what I have here is a slide saying the shape of pandemic data is typical. So if you look at the pandemic benchmarks and where we usually are at this point in the year, compared to the regular benchmarks, we have similar achievement data compared to those other years. Now, what you might say is, well, the pandemic benchmarks are not as rigorous as the normal benchmarks. This is what we've expected. So we're essentially finding what we expected to happen. And when data does that, it's always good news because we feel equipped to handle it and address it. We know the authorizer is going to ask us, what is your data? And then what are you doing about it? Well, do you have data? What does the data say? And what are you doing about it? So I wanted to say a couple of things about this data and then open up to any staff members who wanted to add. So first off, comparing to the regular benchmark, normally at this time of year, we've been 50, 60% of the kids on benchmark, and the target is to get that number up to 75%. And you can see that we're in that range for the pandemic numbers. If you look at the regular benchmark, if we had applied that, which we're not using, we would be at 34% of students. At some future point, we expect the authorizer will tell us, revert back to the regular benchmark times. The idea of accelerated learning is we're pushing toward these pandemic targets, but we're also have in mind the fact that someday we'll be returning to those regular benchmarks. So we're going to be introducing new material while also shoring up foundational skills that students are not showing they have, that they would have otherwise perhaps gotten. So the green is tier 1, and there's a little code there that tells you what that means. That's achieving the benchmark. Tier 2 is the yellow. That's one level below the benchmark. That means different things in different grades, so it's hard to generalize. But essentially, the tiers tell you how many levels behind they are. Last comment is just some really powerful trends here. This chart illustrates, I mean, it's kind of like a stereotype. I could have drawn that without using the data, but the data says it very clearly. Students who are in these different categories of attendance are scoring at tier 1 at corresponding rates on the F&P. So if you're in your seat, you're doing better with your reading. That may be a cause, maybe correlated, or maybe a cause. We don't know if it's because you're showing up that you're getting more data. We assume that's helpful, but there may be other factors, like students who are attending more are also reading more at home and so on. But the really good news was we saw, first of all, 68% of our students grew at least one level. What we're hearing from other schools, and many charters are having the same experience, but in general, across the country, we are seeing schools report that they're not growing. The students are even regressing and going backwards. So that really is learning loss. Our students are improving. They're just not improving at the same rate they used to in normal times. So we feel like we've been working really hard and we're seeing gains and it's paying off. You can see that students with some of the special services have actually grown more than students in the general population, which is pretty exciting for us and not something we always see. We do always see that our pre-K students who went through our school in pre-K outperform our general population students who joined us in kindergarten or after, and that was true this year in growth. I mentioned the attendance factor. So that's where the data lies. Some quick things about what we're doing in response to the data. And then, again, any staff members who wanted to add anything, and then any questions from board members. We always say we're going to respond to the data by shifting groups, changing schedules, and that's not any different, except there's more intensity at this time. Over time, we've added guide reading groups. In certain grades, responding to the attendance data, we've moved reading time up in some grades because it was happening later in the morning and attendance was worse. It's been a consistent trend. So under Mr. Steinberg's leadership, we've moved some of the reading blocks up. And we've got a whole host of staff members who are stepping up and taking additional guide reading groups so we can provide small group instruction that's targeted where kids are with people who have teaching experience and can actually do make kids move. So any staff members who want to add anything, and then any questions from board members.
See, maybe I missed it, but can you just articulate for the group what the typical growth level is, just so we have a comparison to this one level?
What percentage of students move, you mean?
Correct.
Typically?
Or what the levels are. So general in a non-pandemic year, students generally move 2 levels, 1.5 levels, what?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think it varies, you know, year to year. I think if we said in a normal year that 68% of our students grew at least 1 level, I don't think we'd be dissatisfied. You know, I don't think the growth has been really strong. I mean, Dan, Aviva, you might disagree. We would like 100% to grow, but I don't think we see, I don't think we can see 2/3 of our kids growing and saying, well, you know, it must be a bad year. I think that was a really strong showing of growth.
I think I'm asking the question slightly differently, not what percentage of the students grow 1 level, but what is the average number of levels of growth?
Okay, so the average growth this year, which isn't on the slide, is about a little more than 1 level. So it can take, putting all the students together, including the couple kids who went back a level, and there really only were a few, the kids who were flat and the kids who moved up 2, 3, 4, up to 6 levels. The average was like 1.05 or 1.1, something like that. And the numbers don't really work that way because, like I said, they mean different things in different grades, but just giving a rough cut average. The way the benchmarks work, the expectation is the average would be 1 level in the upper grades and 1 or 2 levels in first grade, maybe 3 levels in the lower grades. So not that much more than we got in our average.
Okay.
Just to be
Steve,
clear.
excuse me, I have to go. Brandy, would you take on chairing the rest of the meeting, please?
I actually have to leave at 1:05.
I think we'll be
or
done.
slightly before that 1. So I don't know if someone else can. I also have to leave early, unfortunately.
I'm trying to think who's there. John, are you still there?
I think
I am.
Oh, there we are.
Would you
I
take?
am. No, I'm here.
Yeah, I've got to run off to a doctor's meeting and I can't delay it. So would you close off the meeting for us, please? Thank you. And I'll
Sure.
talk to you all
Thanks.
soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Just one follow-up item. Can we get appreciate that this is an average, Steve, so I understand what you're saying, and that's a very helpful explanation of the data. For the next meeting, can we get disaggregated, like, I guess, grade by grade comparison of what our growth level is this year versus what would be typical for a non-pandemic year? And you know, that's not to be critical, just trying to get a sense of, you know, really where we are in comparison to, you know, non-pandemic circumstances.
Yeah, we'll have to have the Ed committee. We had our Ed committee meeting right after the data came in, so we'll have a lot of analysis to share then. But even what you were going to say, you were going to expand upon what I said or clarify.
No, just to clarify, I think just to be clear, like in first grade, in a typical school year, children grow 6 reading levels. So they go from what's called level C to level I. That's a typical year. This year we adjusted, so the end of year benchmark is H, so it's 1 less, so it's technically 5 levels. But as we talked about in the Ed committee, children entered this school year not maybe normally where they came in. A lot of children didn't have technology in the spring, weren't participating actively. And so we had children enter first grade even at level A, right? And so to grow from level A to level H is adding a couple of more. So they might have to grow like 8 or 9 levels this year. And so we noticed that in grades 1 and 2, where decoding and comprehension are the 2 things that we're focusing on in reading in general, that the decoding skills in grade 1 especially, there are some levels where it's just so hard to jump, but once you do it, you're in an okay place. And so this is that time of year where we're seeing that. But I think in this year, in a pandemic year, we saw children in first grade, if you looked at the data a little bit more closely for first grade in particular, for example, you'd see that children grew 2 or 3 or 4, et cetera levels. And that makes sense given the first grade parameters versus, you wouldn't see that in 4th grade. That wouldn't make sense to grow that many levels typical because of like how the levels are organized, but I'd say in first grade and second grade, it's the most levels to grow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for that context. So I think that's why it's all the more important to sort of understand on a grade level by grade level basis. So looking forward to that disaggregation.
Any more comments or questions? Janelle, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Do you have any thoughts? Seeing that special education data point probably gives you a little pride.
Sure. I mean, I guess my thoughts, I spoke to this a little bit at our professional day last week, but yeah, especially there were certain grades where special education students with IEPs grew a significant amount over versus in other grades. So I'm looking to see kind of to figure out what the reason for that was, and have been thinking about how to incorporate that specific piece into coaching for the next cycle.
Okay, any last comments before we wrap up? Well, John, reviving a role you haven't played in like 8 or 9 years, I think. Is that long? 7 years? You want to close us out? Jonathan Barrett, are you there?
Tap twice if you can hear us.
You can't blink twice because we can't see him. All right, well, I think we're wrapped up. Thank you all, and we will be reopening tomorrow. We didn't talk about that much, but that's a big thing for us right now, and so see some of you on campus. Take care.
Bye, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, guys, thank you. Thanks, guys. Father.
Bye now, John.